I spent 2 months analyzing over 300 of the most popular Clash Royale decks to see if I could discover any trends in the game, and this is what I learned. So let's start with the setup. I set out to understand Clash Royale as a bipartite network. What is a bipartite network, you may ask? It is a network whose nodes can be divided into 2 sets, such that each link connects a node from the first set to a node in the second set. In this case, the first sets of nodes are the cards, and the second sets of nodes are the deck archetypes. For the purpose of this project, I used the 7 deck archetypes as outlined in this very thoughtful Reddit post. If you haven't read it yet, I highly suggest you go read it. It was very informative. The 7 deck archetypes are Beatdown, Cycle, Bait, Split Lane, Siege, Bridge Spam, and Control. For data collection, I used the Popular Decks tab on Royale API, and they essentially have a list of the top 20 most popular decks at a certain point in time. The difficult part was that they actually don't have an archive where you can see the data from previous seasons. So for that, I used the Wayback Machine, which if you don't know, is just a tool in which you can see the websites at a certain point in the past. I essentially put the link royaleapi.com/deck/popular into the Wayback Machine, and it gives you a calendar where you can see when snapshots of a website was taken. I took 1 snapshot from each season, and since there isn't a snapshot available on every single day, I tried to take from as close to the end of that particular season as possible. As you know, Clash Royale has a new season every month, and so I analyzed the popular decks from seasons 57 through 74, which ran from March 2024 to September 2025. For the data analysis, the first step was to extract the raw data from these websites. So I wrote a script that turned each of these decks into a list with all of the cards. Once I had the raw data, I then had to sort the decks into archetypes, which was the hard part. The way I did this was by recognizing the signature cards of a certain archetype, and if a deck had any of those cards, then I sorted it into that archetype. So for example, if a deck has cards such as Golem, Lava Hound, and Giant, it was sorted into Beatdown. If it has Expo, Mortar, it was sorted into Siege, and you get the idea. And if a deck didn't have any of these card signatures, then I classified it as unknown. It's not a perfect system by any means, but I want to keep it simple for this analysis. And I used a multi-label classification, so one deck could technically belong to multiple archetypes. And I generated some plots that I will go over. So here is the bipartite network visualization. In the red, we have deck archetypes, and in the blue, we have the cards. This is a weighted network, and the weight is determined by the number of times a certain card appears in an archetype across all datasets. So the thicker lines indicate that a card is strongly associated with a specific archetype. If we zoom in a bit, we can see that the archetype with the thickest edges is the Cycle archetype, and they're heavily connected to Skeletons, Knight, Ice Spirit, and Log. This makes sense because these are all very cheap cards, so you would expect to see them show up in Cycle decks, which relies on using cheap cards to cycle quickly. Here's another type of visualization that is more traditionally what comes to mind when you think of a bipartite network. We can see the same relationship between the Cycle archetype and the cards I just mentioned. So if you're a nerd like me and want a summary of the network, there are a total of 111 nodes and 351 edges. And if you recall, there are actually 121 cards in the game, and this means that 10 cards were completely absent and not present in any of the decks. To get the weighted degree, I had to project the bipartite graph onto one with just cards and one with just archetypes. So for card projection, 2 cards are connected if they appear together in at least one deck, with edges weighted by the number of decks they both appear. For archetype projection, 2 archetypes are connected if a card appears in both of them. Cards have an average weighted degree of 14.06, which means that the typical Clash Royale card appears in approximately 14 decks across the dataset. Archetypes have an average weighted degree of 181, reflecting the fact that as a whole, cards are pretty versatile. There are a lot of cards that appear in a lot of different deck archetypes, which means that the game developers are doing a pretty good job. As you can imagine, the game would be pretty boring if every card could only be used in one type of deck. So the next thing I did was to graph the popularity of different deck archetypes throughout the seasons. It's interesting to see that some archetypes like Control are always present in the meta, but seem to have certain spikes in certain seasons, probably related to changes in the meta at the time. Right now, Cycle decks are by far the most popular, and this aligns with my personal observations. I think a lot of matchups that I've been facing have been against a lot of Cycle decks. So here's another way to visualize the same data. This is a heat map that shows the fractional share all the archetypes have in the meta over time. The lighter color indicates a greater fractional share. So again, Cycle is definitely the dominant archetype, followed by Control. The next thing I looked into was a quantity that I defined as entropy. For this, I used the standard equation for Shannon entropy. This basically tells us how versatile a certain card is in its ability to appear in a variety of deck archetypes. This was actually quite surprising. Arrows ranked number 1, which makes sense, but Goblinstein actually ranked number 2, despite the fact that it is only used in 65 decks across my dataset. It is actually a very versatile card. Other versatile cards cards include Ice Wizard, Prince, and Tornado. I think the spells showing up here really don't surprise me because spells are in general very versatile, but the non-spell cards are really interesting to see. Another card I was surprised to see on here was Phoenix, which ranked as the number 7 most versatile card. I know they just buffed it recently, but Phoenix is generally considered a pretty weak card. And I think this is actually what makes it so versatile because it doesn't have to be a very specific usage. It can be used across a variety of archetypes. It just goes to show that just because a card shows up often doesn't necessarily make it versatile. And I think this brings up an interesting question, which is what actually makes a good card? Is it a card that can be used in a variety of different ways? Or is it a card that is very good at one specific usage? I don't really have an answer to that question, but feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments below. And finally, we calculate the archetype volatility, which is how susceptible archetypes are to changes in the meta. These are ordered from least volatile to most, and as we can see, Split Lane is actually the least volatile of the archetypes. But we should keep in mind that there is a sampling bias here because there weren't a lot of Split Lane decks to begin with, so it makes sense that they would be less volatile. The more popular decks like Cycle, Control, and Beatdown are naturally going to be more volatile in this graph because they appear in our dataset more often. What's interesting to see in this graph is that Beatdown is the most volatile, and this supports what we saw in the archetype popularity graph, which shows that Beatdown had a pretty big spike in March to May of 2024, but has since dipped in popularity. Again, I'm not an expert, but this aligns with my general feeling, which is that beatdown decks are not as popular as they used to be. This is all the analysis that I have today, but I'm gonna end the video with some possible extensions of this research in the future. One important note is that this does not take into account evolutions at all, because it would have been too much of a hassle to differentiate between the Evo cards and the non-Evo cards in the network, but that is definitely something that is worth looking into in the future when I have more time. And obviously the elephant in the room, they're adding heroes with the new update, so that will probably drastically change the archetype popularity. I saw Riley tweet about how it's going to reduce deck variability and that more people will be playing the same type of deck since you can have 2 evolutions and 2 heroes or champions. So it will be interesting to perhaps redo this analysis in a year or so to see how heroes have impacted the game. And lastly, I didn't really make any predictions using this data, but I can definitely see someone who knows a little bit more about the game using this data to make predictions about how the dev team will balance certain cards in the future. Right now, given the fact that cycle decks so heavily dominate the meta, I think we might see a nerf to some of these cards going forward to maybe balance out the different deck archetypes, and maybe we'll see revival of the beatdown archetype in the future. But that's all for this video. Let me know if you liked me doing this sort of nerdy data analysis of Clash Royale. I might try and do a few more in the future. And also let me know if you think my results are accurate and if you agree with my predictions. But that's all for now. I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!